Mac was like a distant step-parent. Finally, after a decade of union struggles, Mac shut down Brockway. In the late 70s, Cortland was devastated. It's recovered somewhat since that time, but it's a different Cortland in a different America. Cortland is just one small town of many throughout this country that has undergone a transformation. A small town that continues to struggle in the 90s to redefine itself. In Huskietown, USA, we'll explore the questions, what have we lost, and what can be recovered? For you see, as the Husky dog is to Cortland, Cortland is to America, a symbol of a bygone day, a time when America was a big quilt of small towns that worked.
Well, if you follow me down into the storage area, we ordinarily don't have anyone down here except the meter man and the furnace man. And here is our Husky dog. Well, he has been our property since the Brockways left Cortland. This was outside of the Brockway factory on Central Avenue over the main door.
At first we had a chrome-plated Husky on the radiator. Then in 1962, it was our 50th anniversary, and I introduced a gold Husky. And that was the first gold emblem in the industry. And I'm proud to say that about 5 years later, Mac made their Bulldog in gold. So there was some always rivalry between Mac and Brockway.
The older they are, the harder they are to shift. Just partial to them. I was brought up around it. It was probably bred into me. My father worked there. My father-in-law worked there. I guess I'm just partial to Brockway.
The day we were told that the plant was going to close was devastating, was a funeral.
I think it gives me a sense of security to see that guy walking down the street, knowing he's getting a pension from Brockways, which carries him through times when you know damn well Social Security wouldn't have done it.
We've had hip operations and knee operations and things that have been taken care of, right?
Right.
All through the union plan.
We wouldn't have had anything. We would have been
Wiped us dry.
wiped us dry. We wouldn't have
Taking
had
everything we had saved, or
That's, like you say,
it's a big item.
That's a big item. That's my sense of security of ever working in Brockway.
It was thought when Mack Truck purchased Brockway, it was going to close it right away, or at least phase it out very quickly. And the gentleman, Mr. Matthews, who came here as the manager, got caught up in the spirit of Brockway's, and he tried to keep the company from closing. But then there was an economic squeeze, and the unionized workers were asked to take a cut in pay, or at least not an increase that they wanted, and that resulted in a strike.
It wasn't all union. It was management and union and MAC, and there was a lot of elements that went into that the ordinary guy on the street didn't understand or know about, but they hated to see Brockway go, and especially the businessmen around town that liked that extra buck that these guys were making, and selling cars and homes and furniture and appliances. They knew that this was going to hurt because here's a workforce. At that time, I guess we'd say it probably was down to about 600 people, but they were making good money.
As sometimes happens, people began smaller businesses. Some Brockway men went into business repairing Brockway trucks that may not have paid quite as handsomely, but it gave them the spirit of independence that had been sort of forced upon them.
People of Cortland had all their marbles in one basket with Brockways. Before Brockways, it was Wickwires. And then everybody wanted to work at Brockways. And now everybody wants to get into Rubbermaid. And I think that's what he's saying in essence is we still got our marbles in one basket. If something happens to Rubbermaid and they go.
So what's the difference between the baskets?
What's the difference between the baskets?
Is it the same thing working for Rubbermaid as it is for working for Brockway?
Well, we would have to say no because
I think you'd have to ask them people that.
We were moving around.
You know,
we were doing different. Where I have been down there at the Rubbermaid, and these people stand 8 hours and do their shift. There's not the. We floated. I don't know how to say.
What do they call it? Camaraderie?
Our product
I
was
believe,
enormous, and theirs is put up in a box.
Today, you take 16 minutes of a 15-minute break, and they're going to fire you.
I had a.
You get rode up for it. That's not family.
I had a father-in-law who
That's
had
money.
40-some years in. And I've heard him talk of a guy named Severance. And he had a daughter who was CP. And they needed extra money. He'd go to the Severance. They would give him the money. Somebody would loan him a decent car. And they'd take off and go up north to the special doctor. The wood shop. They didn't throw the wood away like people do today. They'd load it into a dump truck, and they had names you put in the hat, and the names were drawn out of the hat. And the wood was given to them. It was good hardwood. They were just, like they say,
I think it's all in one piece
family
families.
needs. It was just.
Today, business doesn't care about the individual except get in, go to work, get your work out, do what you got to do for me, and then go on home.
We just had Roy Clark last week, and we had Loretta Lynn before that, and Charlie Price, George Jones. So it's really this has been a great thing for the community.
Can you show us the whole thing?
Yes, I will. Here you'll see a complete outfit of Ernest Tubbs, and this is the last outfit that Ernest Tubbs' band, one of his members, wore before he passed away. This dress here was a $9,000 dress from Tammy Wynette. Tex Rowe is a performer. Well, Tex was in the performed a lot with the USO when he was in service. He now has a store here in Portland selling Western boots. And as you can see, this is a record that was made by your Brockway people.
With her headlights brightly gleaming and her Jimmy engine screaming, Ann and Noel will get together by and by. Iron fire, shooting pony. Iron fire, shooting pony was her name. Iron fire, shooting pony. You should be in the Truckers Hall of Fame. You should be in the Truckers Hall of Fame.
There were families who had members who generation after generation after generation had worked for Brockway and had been very loyal to Brockway and felt betrayed.
Very proud. In fact, I always, if I'm riding with my grandchildren or something, I tell them, says, gee, I helped build that truck. And they all say, you did, Poppy? You did, Poppy? Yeah, that's where I used to work.
You're 93, right here. Just a young kid.
Got together and decided that we probably should get into some very aggressive economic development. And so we started an economic development fund. We hired an economic developer. And over a period of a very short time, we saw some very dramatic changes in the community.
I was going to sell my car to make money to get back to Colorado, and I couldn't sell my car. So I wound up taking a job here, staying here for a couple of years. And as my folks were approaching retirement age, I just bought into their business, and then here I am, 8 years later. And then at 23 or so, I was asked to run for the city council in the district where I grew up, to be able to feel like you can make an influence in the community. I think that's one of the nice things for me, about being in a small town, is you can, put some effort in and you can actually see the results, even if it's, Main Street not flooding the way it used to. I mean, it's nice, and you get a lot of satisfaction out of that. I do anyway. 7 or 8 years ago, standing here, you would have had a clear shot to the other end of town. The street that we're standing on extended to the end of town, and was 2 blocks of it were closed off so that Rubbermaid could expand and have a workable plant here on the old Brockway site. I guess there are 400 plus employees there now. I'm not sure the exact number. It's a lot of blue-collar jobs, some management positions. Any engineering for Rubbermaid products happens not here, but in Worcester, Ohio, so this is, or elsewhere, I guess. So this is primarily the manufacturing plant.
Sense now that who knows how long they're going to be here. Where I think back when Brockway was here, during their heyday, people assumed they'd always be here. Life wasn't going to change.
How does that uncertainty work in terms of what you have to do then as being mayor?
It means that you always have to try to show that those companies that are here and the ones we are making the sacrifices for are giving us things in return. For instance, the downtown redevelopment that we've done over the last 2 years, we paid for that with community development dollars, and those community development dollars came from paybacks on a UDAG loan that Rubbermaid received. So Rubbermaid went out and got this Urban Development Action Grant, and they don't pay back the federal government, they pay back the local community. Well, that's going to give us about $3.8 million over a period of 6 or 8 years. Well, we took that money and we revitalized our downtown. There's a lot of ways to spend money, and there's a need for it, especially with the infrastructure redevelopment. is what's politically acceptable at the time. How far can we go to where we can't push it anymore this year, where we can't raise taxes anymore? So that's the biggest hurdle. But I think that when people see the changes being made, and I think they have here, that they are more willing to accept the tax consequences. But it's, again, all of these big corporations that are here are not paying the taxes yet because most of them are on IDA property. The college, which is a great economic force, doesn't pay any property tax. Over 50% of our land base is tax exempt. The president of the college is quick to say, well, look at all the sales tax our students generate, and that's true. But for every benefit it gives us, it makes it difficult for us to be the city they want us to be, to provide the services the city should provide. So that's really a tough thing. Low-level waste dump site is a classic example of how the electorate today views the environment as a mainstream issue. Small-town grassroots organizations, rural America, they resented the idea that the state legislation was created in a manner that targeted a place like Cortland. They never fully understood that rural New York could stand up politically.
Cortland County, rise to your feet, like farms and stand for your children and the land you love, and never let the poison spread. Those who lie will see you dead. No radiation without.
Dump may not affect me, but it will affect my kids and their kids. And my kids know now that nuclear waste is bad. In fact, when this issue first started, my one other daughter was 5, almost 6, and she would draw pictures of 2-headed cows with an udder in the middle, and they'd be crying. And she would write "No dumping Taylor" above the picture, and I thought that's something for a 6-year-old kid to have to learn about so early. But I'm really glad they are, because they are going to be better people for it. And they also know, thanks to their mother being out in the streets with signs and yelling at politicians and other nasty people, that they can change things if they make enough noise, and they won't be a generation like my generation that quite often just sits back and says, well, we can't do anything about it.
Making it known, people just aren't taking it. We're not expendable, and neither is the land.
I've done a lot of different jobs here. I started out packing parts, and I went from that for a while. I leaned towards, we have a position called a lead packer, and it's kind of our version of quality control on the floor. I did that for a while. I did material service in production for a while, and that's the actual job that makes the parts the color they're supposed to be, and that was fun, but it's not something that I really wanted to do long term. This is better out here. It gives you a wide variety of things to do, but it's good. It's a good routine to get into. I think you tend to be, you tend to look it over. You want to make sure it looks all right. You want to make sure it's a good product. I mean, it's your job. It's what puts food on your table. You want people to look at that product and think, okay.
When we first came, some people had some real concerns where Cortland was going to go. But I think they looked at Rubbermaid, and the community leaders and the civic leaders looked at Rubbermaid and said, this is the kind of shot in the arm we needed. And I want to make sure that you understand is, it's not Rubbermaid that made the turnaround. It's the community that made the turnaround. People aren't just a pair of hands. That we want to tax everybody's brain power and get their suggestions, their ideas on the way to improve. Those companies that are going to be successful are going to utilize the talents of the employees you have, because employees are the most important asset you have. Far more in your building, your equipment, or anything else you have, it's your employees.
And that street is no longer there. And then, in an ironic twist, we named the new street. Since Central Ave was closed, we had to give people better access, so we created a new street so they could get from East Court Street or from Central Ave to Elm Street, we had to create a new street, and we named it DOA after Ronnie Dio, who's a heavy metal rock star who was born right next to the Brockway plant and grew up in that neighborhood. And so our newest street in Cortland is named after a heavy metal rock star who lives in California.
He passed us and ran an oncoming car right off the road.
Whereabouts?
It was about 5 miles out. I got his license plate number and everything.
Was he coming into the city?
Yeah, heading into the city, and he's heading out on Route 13 now.
Okay, did you happen to see the car that went off the road? Is he still off the road?
No, he swerved off, went in the ditch, and then back out. And he apparently kept on going.
Okay, we'll have someone from the Sheriff's Department check on it. Okay?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you. No problem. Now he's wondering why we're riding around with a camera in the front seat of our car. I personally feel very strongly about unions. Obviously, for one reason, I was the president of our union for 3 years. And I think it's something that's needed. For a police department, it's for a company, manufacturer. I can see good and bad for it. I can see the pros and cons. Man trying to survive, obviously a union could do him good because he's going to get him better wages, better working conditions. At the same time, sometimes the union doesn't look at the small man. They're looking at the overall picture. Brockway's, for example, those guys right there said, we want more money. The union made them stay out, made them fight for more money. Brockway's left.
Those who are active in the union movement today suggest that one of the reasons businesses come to Cortland is because it's known as a anti-union community. I don't think the sentiment is that visceral, or that there's a promise is made that come here because unions don't survive here well. I know that I've been involved in discussions with those who've come to the community, and that issue hasn't arisen in the discussions I've been involved in. I think companies like Rubbermaid and others come here for location. I assume they do evaluate the wage scale in the area, and since unions have an effect on the wage scale, that's probably a factor. But I don't think it's overt to the point where it's discussed or Cortland is sold on that basis.
I personally feel that there is a real correlation between the decline of the American labor movement and the decline in the standard of living for Americans. That as you start to see reduced numbers of people in unions, the distribution of wealth gets more lopsided. Like Luann's saying, the lines get sharper. The boss makes more, and the worker makes less. And that's the way they want it. That's the way the Rotary wants it. It's not the way we want it.
But that may also be the underlying cause of the huge drug problem, huge violence problem. Those people who live in the ghettos, poor people. There's so many of them. There's so many homeless people. But at the same time, we've got the top 1% of the people in this country are just making so much money and have gained so much income in the last 10 years through the 80s. And yet these people at the end just getting poorer and poorer and poorer, and more illiterate and more oppressed and just more hopeless. It gets to the point where how do you get yourself out of that? And I think it takes a national commitment, which doesn't look like they have that. So maybe the answer is in these grassroots organizations, labor, environment, civil rights, And like Court said, historically, the labor movement has been right in the middle of all those type of things. And hopefully we can do it again. I don't know where else the impetus is going to come from.
Some of us that are a little older think about that and think about our grandchildren. And why did some of the things get to where they are? Why does pride in your work and some of the other things as they sort of disappeared? Why, when I was learning my trade, was my trade as big as going to college per se? And today, you're doing what?
No matter where you go, other than if you're in a factory like Corona or Trinity, you know, it's part-time work for the generation of today. And there is no survival for these kids. There's like no benefits for them. They get a job wherever they can, and it's really sad.
HERB is a citizen action group that was created almost exactly a year ago, last October, and we are organizing around a very specific dump site, which is the Rosen Brothers junkyard in downtown Cortland, which is a federal Superfund site. The industries that are very close to the dump include Dowser, which we suspect is a significant polluter. In addition to that, the Dowser property, part of it is on the old Wickwire site, and we believe that that site is a contaminated site, probably from the old Wickwire operations. There's Marietta Packaging, which is a plastics, I guess, mainly packaging. I'm not quite sure about that. And we don't really know what kinds of air emissions or whatever might be coming out of that plant. Rubbermaid is the newest addition to the community in terms of large industry, and that, in a sense, directly replaced Brockway in terms of location. And that, of course, is involved in plastics manufacturing, and we know that there are significant quantities of air emissions coming from that plant. Although industrial pollution probably is the bulk of what we're seeing now in Cortland, we also have to look at, just in general, the concentration of development, the effect of things, you know, the presence of gasoline derivatives in the groundwater.
Line, and halt. Mark time. Move and left. Left. Fourth count, turn to the right. Ready. Move in. 1, 2, 3, 4. Fourth count, turn to the right. Ready. Move and turn. 2, 3, 4. Left. Left. Forward. Move and. Nice and smooth. Plant the heel and roll.
What do you think this town will be like in 2 years? Radioactive.
Maybe you see yourself back here?
No, not intentionally, no.
Well,
what's going to happen anyway? I have no idea what's going to happen to the farm.
As far as Cortland's concerned, there's not a whole lot here.
What do you mean?
I mean, the highest position you could probably have in Cortland is the mayor, and it's not very exciting, I would think. Pretty easy job.
Let's get to Mr. Mack on that one.
It's a nice place. It's a nice little town, I guess. I mean, if you're
It's a
college
place to get you started, but you eventually, if you're someone who's gone through high school and you're looking forward to going to college, you're going to want more than Cortland has to offer. But it does have what you need for now.
I think around here, after seeing what happens if you're on the wrong side of the fence in industry, people get pretty scared of that whole area.
I don't think anyone decides to spend their life working in Cortland Corset.
I've had
Rubbermaid.
I actually had some friends that worked at Rubbermaid over the summer, and they said all they did was take something off, take a bowl off the assembly line and put it in a box for 12 hours a day. Yeah. And they found out pretty fast they'd rather go back to school and get an education, find a better job, something you can actually use your brain with.
Half the time there's really nothing to do unless you're a college student or whatever. But so we just pretty much sit around and talk.
There's a major element missing from your statement, Corey.
Come on, Corey, out with it.
Saturday night, if you want to go out and drink, you can, and that's what a lot of people end up doing because they aren't really capable of making their own fun, and so they end up just going out and getting good and trashed and telling stories about what they did when they were good and trashed. So, I mean, it's really sort of a predominant thing in Cortland, a lot more so than I think a lot of people realize.
I don't know if you could say there's one particular song that goes for Cortland, but
I mean,
I don't know. I don't know. Just last year when the marching band, we went to Ottawa, Canada, and when we were coming out on the field, they played "I Love New York." But I mean, that goes for
wait, Bruce Springsteen, my hometown.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
Too generic.
Although we don't like that one.
We don't like it, but it's probably pretty accurate.
My hometown, my hometown. Our main streets, whitewashed windows, and vacant stores. Seems like there ain't nobody wants to come down here no more. They're closing down textile mill across the railroad tracks. Foreman says these jobs are going, boys, and they ain't coming back to your hometown, to your hometown, to your hometown, to your hometown. Last night me and Kay, we laid in bed.
The future of Cortland, we're in a good position now in that there are a lot of small, relatively small companies, manufacturing companies, and other, companies that employ, 25 to 50 people that show promise for growth. So I think it's going to be a more vibrant, widespread community that's not as dependent on a Brockway's or a Wickwires or a Smith Corona for its economic, strength.
I'm not very optimistic in as far as the specific problems Cortland is dealing with now regarding the character of industrial development, and my pessimism is based on what very specific things I see happening with regard to the water quality in particular and the aquifer.
We're not going to die. Small communities don't die. Communities of this size will never die. I'll die, but the community won't.
One time it was Brockway, one time it was Smith Corona. And now I see a turnaround of a lot of smaller companies coming in, which I'm sure the city fathers believe is probably more economically stable for the community, having 50 people working here and 50 people working here, rather than thousands in one place that could pack up and move out. On the other hand, you don't see any large place where there's a future for people. Everyone that's coming in is coming in right above minimum wage, and they are getting the workers to work there, but they're, like Court said, it's the people that are working 2 jobs. They'll work one place during the day and then they waitress or whatever at night to support themselves, and that's not a future.
This is your hometown.
Built in my hometown, I guess.
Hello again. My name is Emil Guillermo, and in order to discuss the issues raised in the documentary Huskietown, USA, we've assembled a distinguished panel. They are John Palmer, currently Dean and Professor of Economics of the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. Professor Palmer has also served as a senior official at the then Health, Education, and Welfare Department under Presidents Nixon and Carter. Our next panelist is Catherine Abrams, an associate professor at law at Boston University. A specialist in local government and voting rights, Professor Abrams has been active in community empowerment issues. And finally, Harry Boyd, a senior fellow at the Hubert H. Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs and director of Project Public Life. He's also the author of Commonwealth, A Return to Citizen Politics. Welcome, panelists. The image that I remember from the film that talked about Cortland presently is the image of seeing a plastic tub on a conveyor belt. It seems symbolic that the main course in Cortland these days are leftovers, that the entree is not, you know, some smashing flambe sort of thing. It's leftovers. And even the idea of that the people they glorify in Cortland are the people who have escaped. Ronnie Dio of Dio Way fame, the heavy metal rocker. And I guess I'd like to pose a question to all of you. And John, first you, how do you judge the quality of life in a community like Cortland and in the Cortlands of America?
Well, I don't read it nearly as negatively as your comment suggested. I mean, I saw a community that was struck a real blow, primarily around the demise of Brockway, that it had to recover and adjust to, as well as other issues that are floating around that they're grappling with. But they seem to me to be really starting to take control of their lives as a community in a very meaningful and significant way, and beginning to come to grips with the realities that they have to face as a result of those changes, and not looking or expecting that there's going to be some sort of answer from heaven, to understand that they have to make it happen themselves. Now, admittedly, there's a lot more help that small communities like that need, I think, from their state governments and the federal government to make it happen. But a great deal of the initiative does have to lie with them, and I think those communities that recognize that and understand it and go about it intelligently will succeed.
Well, we'll address the who do they seek help from, but Catherine, how do you see the quality of life issue in post-Brockway Cortland?
There were a variety of governmental powers that the mayor or the city council used in order to attract more business. They closed streets, they gave tax exemptions, they did things like that, which Mayor Mack referred to slightly as a possible area of controversy when he said, you know, companies like Rubbermaid are bringing money back into the community, which helps with some people when we have to look at something like a tax exemption. But one of the things that I wondered was just how much controversy was generated by some of these moves that were made, and what opportunity was provided for dissenters from the sort of full steam ahead move of the government to voice their point of view.
So you're suggesting that perhaps, not that things were railroaded, but perhaps that there was a dominant and a mainstream view that was just accepted.
Actually,
or adopted.
I'm not suggesting so much as just wondering about what happened, and I guess as a lawyer wondering structurally what opportunities were provided for people who had a dissident point of view or even a questioning point of view to voice that point of view. You know, it came home to me a bit as I listened to Kim Abbey and some of the other activists. Now, she was an activist, I guess, around the nuclear dump issue, seeming to perceive a great distance between herself and those making the decision. She talked about the educational value for her daughter of seeing her mother yell at politicians and some other nasty people or something like that. And I thought, wow, this woman is a political actor, yet she understands herself to be quite far from those who are making the political decisions. And that made me wonder about the role for people like Kim Abbey.
Well, Harry, what does that say about people becoming alienated by the process, or the idea that if people see something like Brockway wrested away from them, it makes them not more active, but less active, or less inclined to act, or less inclined to participate?
Well, I think the interesting thing about post-Brockway Cortland is that it's helped catalyze a variety of kinds of civic action. People don't always call that politics. If you ask people what they think about politics today, they'll see it as a spectator sport that they feel very distant from. But in fact, it is a different kind of politics. And there were a lot of actors in the film. Ron Walsh, the man who was talking about development, and how this was a manageable size community where what you did really could have an impact. Or Kim Abbey, for all of her sense of distance from politicians, also felt she had made a difference. And her kids picked up that lesson. They wouldn't be like her to just take things and be apathetic. I also think, interestingly, the film itself, the fact of the film, the fact of the voices here, creates a different kind of politics, where the public is put back into politics. because people are arguing it out, and people are surfacing issues. One of the most interesting dimensions of that to me was the discussion with teenagers who on the surface were saying, this is an okay town, but we're going to get out of here. But on the other hand, they were saying other things too. For example, they were talking about the alcohol problem on Saturday nights, which is a big issue, and teenagers don't have ways of talking about that in public. In fact, the guy said, if you remember,
so you see,
much more, people don't really know what's going on with teenagers today. It's because a lot of these things are secret unless they're public forums to talk about it.
Yeah, in that statement about alcoholism, you can also see where it really is something that notes the teenagers' despair and the teenagers' lack of hope in the town or lack of future.
Kind of dead end. It's common. It's also not only in small towns that you find problems with alcoholism. And in many ways, this is this is a generation of young people who are very worried about the problems they're inheriting.
Mm-hmm. Well,
but they can't be addressed unless there are public settings in which they can begin to engage the rest of the community, in which they can be challenged and listened to and have a kind of give and take.
But overall, you think life in post-Brockway Cortland is a positive thing?
I think it's changing, but I think what it does is point to a different future in which, at best, as Kathy was saying, they'll be able to draw on traditions that were strong and important traditions and adapt them for the future. I also think that one thing that was very clear from the film is that citizens are going to have to be at the center of that change. They're not going to look to big institutions, whether it's Brockway or big government. They're going to have to take hold themselves, and I think
well, maybe perhaps they have no choice.
Partly a necessity. There's no doubt about it.
Which raises the question, the public policy question, John, of how do we fund a government like this, considering what the mayor said, that he's taxed the people to the hilt. There's a very small portion of the property that can be taxed. There is a sales tax, but who's going to finance the future in towns like Cortland?
Oh, that's a real dilemma, and I think that, there are limits to how much they can rely entirely on their own resources to face some of the challenges they are. I mean, I certainly agree with what Harry and Kathy are saying about the need for them to be more active and take the initiative, but I think there's a certain type of resource that they need to look to state and federal government for. And one of the things that we lost in the early 1980s was general revenue sharing, which took use of the income tax, which is the widest and most progressive tax we have in the country, to redistribute money from areas that were well off and people who were well off to small and poor local communities.
So what, are you suggesting perhaps a restoration of that?
I think that's one thing.
Revenue sharing, the UDAG grant, which the community had been able to use for attracting Rubbermaid and then getting money back to do economic revitalization. UDAG grants have been under attack in the 80s too. So there are a variety of resources, as John is saying, that are potential tools. I do think it points to a different understanding of the role of government. If the classical conservative view is that government is the problem, as Ronald Reagan used to say, and in some ways the Great Society liberal view is that government is a solution, citizens in a town like Brockway are looking for a different mix, where government is seen more as a resource and a source of tools and assistance, and
rather than imposing particular
rather than either the solution or the problem.
So that means that you have to go to government for the financing, but how is that going to happen in the future? We have states now that are trying to battle off billions of dollars in deficits, and in California just recently they raised in some municipalities in the large populous areas the sales tax to 8.25%. Are we coming to a day when we'll see taxation being not a dirty word as it has been the last 10 years, but maybe a word that we'll have to recognize as a savior to
well, I think we're seeing some swing in the pendulum now. I mean, we had the tax revolt, which really occurred initially and more forcefully at the state and local level than it did at the federal level, and a lot of states and localities put very heavy restrictions and cut back taxes, and now they're realizing that those taxes were necessary to pay for a lot of important services that they want, and they're going to have to make some very tough choices. But I think part of the direction we're moving is more inclination to say, yeah, we're willing to raise taxes to hold on or to expand certain kinds of critical services, but we're applying a harder test to it. We're going to hold the politicians accountable to making sure that those services are provided efficiently and that are more responsive to what we at the community level feel.
But John, how practical is more taxation if, as you say, there's a greater polarization in between the wealthy and the rich? The people who don't seem to have the wherewithal to pay more taxes. Does it mean more progressive taxes, more taxing?
Well, that's why I
of the
put the emphasis on revenue sharing, because I think there are real limits to what you can do through typical local tax bases, which tend to be sales taxes and property taxes, which are not very progressive. So that there's a certain need for some of the revenues that support these activities that go to locality to come from a national tax base that's progressive, and the income tax is that source.
All right, so maybe we've solved some questions about where to get the money, but at the same time, Catherine, we're seeing a time where the trend seems to be away from federalism and more toward states and local governments becoming more and more self-reliant. How does that work, or how does that play into this picture? Are they in position to live up to this new role?
Yeah, I'm not sure that they're either financially equipped to live up to it, nor in all cases that they have the inclination to try to live up to it. I mean, one of the movements that I find thought-provoking and a little bit distressing, it's so complicated that I think that it's not right to label the whole thing distressing, but is the move toward privatization of different services by local governments. The idea that the public sector is responsible for sort of a shrinking set of things, accompanied by a move in certain localities by the wealthiest citizens to withdraw from their communities and establish their own private schools, their own private security systems, and such things, so that one answer that we've been seeing in municipalities, and not one that I favor, to states and localities having to make do with a shrinking pie, is that they provide a shrinking array of services and in turn condition people in the community to expect less from the public and seek more within their own sub-local private groups.
Well, what does that say, Harry, about public life? It seems if everything's shrinking, it means the public life must be shrinking too.
I think towns like Cortland, and I think the whole country really, face two very different paths and possibilities now. One leads in the direction Kathy is suggesting towards kind of a balkanization, kind of Northern Ireland writ large on a continental scale, where every group retreats into its enclave. Government is taken apart. The people who are the richest or the best off get the best services. That's a possibility. And that's a possibility that has no role for public life. And the other possibility, and you can see that in the documentary, that possibility, the kind of rancor and the sense of powerlessness and distance. And the other possibility leads towards citizens taking hold in a new way, developing what John is talking about, ways to hold government and economic institutions more accountable. The question of accountability is really on people's minds in all sorts of arenas now. Developing ways to surface things which otherwise are secret and hidden, issues like the alcoholism among teenagers, and talk about it, work on it as a community, as a public. So I think we face two very different possibilities, and in a lot of ways the decision is up to us. Citizen is up to the citizens and what we do.
Well, it's up to the citizens, but also don't forget the corporations now that are in this mix. And John, a question I have for you is, we have a situation where towns like Cortland have to raise taxes, and yet at the same time they give numerous breaks to large corporations. And when do the corporations start paying their fair share?
This is a real difficulty, and we find where different towns and localities start competing with each other to try to win industry into the area on the basis of the tax breaks that they give. And I think the more that happens, the more it does have to be dealt with as a national issue and problem.
So what is the way to deal with that as a national issue?
There is no easy answer to it. And I think that more conscious policies at the state level, at the local level, at the regional level, to try to think about economic development as a broader regional issue as opposed to just a particular local issue, to think about issues of the kind of education of the workforce that's going to be necessary, which to a great extent is a responsibility at the state level, but there's a federal role and there's a local role, to think about questions of what kinds of tax incentives and supports that can occur with federal policy and state policy will provide general support for the kind of economic development we want to do without just getting into competition among specific localities.
But when there is that competition among localities to make their area more attractive to corporations, Catherine, a question I have for you is, doesn't that encourage perhaps giving corporations carte blanche to do as they please? And maybe does that encourage the attitude among corporations that, well, a little pollution won't hurt if it means pumping money into the economy?
Well, I guess I'm not entirely as negative as that, because I think that there's an opportunity, even when municipalities are engaging in competitive corporate bonanzas, for citizens to resist them.
Well, we saw where citizens groups were able to stop a dump site. Are there examples nationwide to suggest that this is this is a very strong, powerful
I think, again, there's some stories in this documentary of strong and effective citizen action, a different kind of politics in which citizens really are players rather than just observers. And they ranged from Ron Walsh, who talks about making a difference in economic development in downtown, to Kim Abbey, and the toxic waste dump campaign, which are part of national campaigns, I'll bet, because there have been very successful nationwide campaigns around issues like toxic waste. In fact, without a large citizen movement in 1985, there would not be a super fund that identifies especially hazardous waste dumps. And that takes skill. It takes building coalitions. It takes learning to work with people you may not like or agree with, but you figure out you have some common ground here. And it's also a kind of schooling in democracy and politics, where people learn how to negotiate, how to find out what information they need, how to go to the government and find out who to talk to. And one of the interesting things about America and towns like Cortland is that in a lot of ways the last 10 or 15 years, all sorts of people have learned new public skills that we didn't used to have.
So how successful these movements are really depends a lot on how you define success. I mean, in a lot of instances, the particular minute goal or specific goal which is sought might not be accomplished. You know, you can't, citizens can't stop a plant from closing. But what they might be able to do is make sure that the court that's responsible for adjudicating the disposition of the plant in bankruptcy gives it to a bidder who is committed to keeping it in the community, something that happened in Elizabeth, New Jersey, for example. Or you can have a situation where citizens communicate to the government their ability to mobilize around certain issues in a way that causes the government to take them more seriously in the future.
But there is a sense that on the local level you can see results, so the frustration level is a lot lower, perhaps.
It might be, yeah.
But it's also why local communities have made alliances and connections with other communities on regional and even national levels.
Well, one thing that struck me toward the end of the film is seeing the motto of Cortland, roots in the past, hope for the future. And I was wondering if you as panelists think that there is much of a future in Cortland. Harry?
There is a possibility in a town like Cortland, and it's the same possibility as there is for the country as a whole, that we'll have a kind of rebirth of public spirit and energy and creativity, really tapping the common sense and the practical skills of ordinary people in a way I think we've gotten away from in most of the century, as when we've seen big institutions and experts and professionals make most of the decisions about policy and where we're going. The possibility is for citizens to take hold again and to recognize that politics, or public life, as citizens practice it, really is. It's like a craft. It's not something you're born knowing how to do. You learn it. There's a lot of practical art involved. You have to learn how to pull in other kinds of groups that you haven't dealt with. One of the real needs in a community like Cortland is to find out ways to involve young people, for example, not simply as saying what's on their minds, but as real participants in problem solving.
How do you keep the young people from going away? Because there was a sense that the young people didn't have a sense of future in their town. They had a sense that this was okay for now, but they were ready to leave. And if I know that in your writings you have said that you need this shared sense of community, and if you don't get that from the young, who do you get it from? From an aging population, or from yuppies who move up to a nice, quaint country home? What is the role of youth here? Should they stick around, and will there be some role for them?
It's possible. And I think that the lesson of the communities I've seen is that young people are much more likely to stay if they see ways to get involved and to help create the future that they're going to have to live in.
Well, John, is there a suggestion that you would make to our national policymakers that would be that would take into account the plight of these small towns in some domestic program that we're still unclear of whether we have or not in this day and age?
There's an arsenal of tools that the federal government has available to it that it has used at various times in the past, some of which I think have been very successful, and we've abandoned them, and we should go back to them to give more possibilities of resources to
like revenue sharing,
like revenue sharing, like the
urban development action grants,
right.
A variety of programs.
You know.
And Catherine, from your perspective,
it's hard to know what I would be if I were a 15-year-old student, but if I were watching the women in CURB and in CARD talk about what they've learned from organizing against these dumps, I might feel that there was more of a future for me in Cortland, because these are people who have really developed skills and care enough about the community to bring them to bear.
Harry, we're going to have to see some kind of revolution, some kind of pendulum swing the other way from where we seem to be heading from the last 10, 20 years. We're going to have to see a mini revolution of sorts that would make people feel empowered.
Well, you can look at it as a revolution. You can look at it as going back to the founding vision in a more pluralistic and inclusive way, but the Jeffersonian vision that the only guarantee of liberty is the citizens, or as he said, the only safe depository of power is the citizenry themselves, and citizens have to learn how to keep that power.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. I'd like to thank our distinguished panelists, John Palmer, Catherine Abrams, and Harry Boyd. I'm Emil Guillermo. Thank you for joining us. Good night.